The 2002 superhero movie Spider-Man was directed by Sam Raimi and was the first movie in the famous Spider-Man trilogy. The movie centers on the origin of the Marvel superhero of the same name. It would go on to inspire 2 other movies. After being stalled for almost 25 years, it was finally released by Columbia Pictures in 2002. It became the first film to gross over $100 million in a single weekend and was also the most successful film based on a comic book at its time. The second movie was made in 2004 and centered around how Peter had struggled to balance his personal life with being a hero and grossed to be the 3rd highest film of that year at $789 million worldwide, while the 3rd movie was made in 2007, which exposed us to the dark side of Peter and new villains. The movie grossed $890.9 million, becoming the 3rd highest movie of the year 2007 and highest grossing Spider-Man film until it was dethroned by the 2019 Spider-Man Far From Home. All comic lovers know that the death of Uncle Ben was very instrumental to the creation of Spider-Man as a character, and the impart of his death went on to shape his journey not just through this particular movie, but the sequels in the comic book. What if the events of the Spider-Man trilogy went differently? Now, imagine Uncle Ben didn't die. How do you think the story would have gone? We would like to explore the possibilities that would have been presented if Uncle Ben was not killed. In today's fan fiction, we explore 4 scenarios that could occur if Uncle Ben had not died and how it would have affected the timeline of the Spider-Man trilogy. Be sure to make your choice since you can pick the progression of the story yourself and find out what happened. Sit back, watch, and enjoy.
No, wait, sir. Get in! What are you doing?
Peter Parker got bitten by a radioactive spider that made him more than human. He got into a wrestling match to raise money for a car to impress Mary Jane. Peter wreaked havoc during the wrestling match, beating his competitor half to death and invoking fear into all who watched, including the promoter. He then collected his full fee from the promoter, who intended to cheat him, but after watching his match, didn't dare. On his way home, he got attacked by a thief who happened to be Flint Marco, who was trying to raise money for the surgery of his daughter and wife. Peter trashed him half to death until he was unconscious. The police later found him and took him to the hospital, where the injuries he sustained placed him in a coma for the next few years. When he finally woke up, he was told his daughter and mother had passed on. He blamed the person who had put him in a coma and vowed to find him. He still remembered Peter's face as vivid as day and soon began to track him down. In his zeal to find Peter Parker, he found out that Peter Parker was the famous Spider-Man, the vengeful vigilante that operated in New York City, and in a face-off with Peter Parker, he fell into a particle divider that merged his DNA with sand, turning him into the Sandman. Peter kills the Sandman in front of Uncle Ben. After the accident that turned Flint Marco into the Sandman, Peter had thought that he had been able to get rid of Flint once and for all, but Flint, with his ability to keep track of Peter, looking for the perfect time to strike. On a sunny day, Peter went to the beach with his uncle and aunt. There was no perfect time to attack. Flint had his element everywhere, so he attacked. As usual, Peter disappeared to change into his Spider-Man costume while he hid his identity. The Sandman used the opportunity to attack Uncle Ben and Aunt May, capturing them before Peter surfaced as Spider-Man. Seeing that the Sandman had attacked his family, Peter was enraged and responded with extreme aggression, throwing heavy things at Sandman and trying to free his uncle and aunt. In the process, a fridge he had thrown towards the Sandman hit Aunt May and made her unconscious. Fearing for her life and Uncle Ben's life, he stopped holding back and fought the Sandman hard with everything he got, shooting webbings at him and trying to trap him. He picked a gas cylinder from a nearby food stand, set it ablaze, and sent it towards the Sandman in an attempt to turn him into glass. The attempt was a failed one, as the beach provided enough sand for the Sandman to just reform over and over again with every attack. Peter began to think. Fire was not his only weakness that sand had, there was also water. He used the web to draw a jet propeller close to him, using it. He fired streams of water at the Sandman, disintegrating him and flushing him into the ocean. With Aunt May unconscious, Uncle Ben horrifyingly watched as the Sandman struggled to reform to no avail. He watched the Sandman try to crawl through the beach while he screamed that he was going to kill everything Peter held dear, because Peter had taken everything from him. At that moment, Uncle Ben realized that Peter was Spider-Man and tried to stop him from ending the Sandman, telling him that he was not in the place to kill another human being. But Peter refused and said the only way to truly end it was if the Sandman was gone for good. In a fit of rage, Peter continued firing streams of water at Flint until nothing was left of him. Uncle Ben was still horrified, told Peter that he could not believe that Peter had thrown all the values he taught him in the name of justice. Peter told Uncle Ben that he was the hero and had to do all the necessary to keep everyone safe. But Uncle Ben told him that there was no difference between him and the bad guys. It was obvious that that moment he was ashamed of his choices. He then told Uncle Ben that defeating criminals at any cost was the great responsibility that came with great power, and if that made him like the criminals, then he had accepted it. He then told Uncle Ben that Aunt May couldn't know that he was Spider-Man, and then told Uncle Ben that he was leaving and that he had to do it to keep them safe. If he remained with them, he was going to keep putting them in this kind of danger. He then told Uncle not to look for him and that he would come back when all his work was done. From that day on, they never saw Peter Parker, but endlessly watched the exploits of the vengeful Spider-Man on the news. Aunt May dies instead of Uncle Ben. Peter and Harry had taken an apartment in town together, and during Thanksgiving, they invited their respective family and friends over for Thanksgiving dinner. It turned out that Norman, who had come to attend the dinner, was just Flint Marco in disguise. During the dinner, Norman, who was really the Sandman, was not convincing enough, and Peter's spider sense was going off, signaling to him that there was danger around. Flint, knowing he was suspected, turned back to himself and released a wave of sand, attacking everyone that was present at the dinner, forcing Peter to use his powers and try to defend everyone, revealing himself to be Spider-Man. During the fight, Peter had been distracted because he was concerned and was trying very hard to keep everyone from danger. He had not realized that the roof over him was caving in. Uncle Ben had pushed him away from the falling debris and saved his life, but in that moment, when Peter and Uncle Ben were distracted, the Sandman threw Aunt May off the balcony in the confusion. Peter heard Aunt May scream out for help, and as he tried to go save her, the Sandman trapped him in sand. Peter screamed as he watched Aunt May fall to her death. Flint, satisfied to see Peter in the same pain he had inflicted on him, freed him and the others while he proceeded to escape. As Peter jumped down to see if Aunt May was still alive, only to find her bleeding out. He immediately carried her and tried to push her to the central hospital, but on the way, she touched his face with bloody hands and died. Meanwhile, Harry was pissed that Peter had been Spider-Man all this while and kept it from him. He came to Aunt May's funeral in respect for her, but had decided that Peter was not his real friend. Peter blamed himself for Aunt May's death, even though Uncle Ben had told him several times that it wasn't his fault. Peter then kept himself locked up, carrying the guilt of Aunt May's death. Peter decided that his only goal in life was to take revenge on Flint Marco for destroying his life and killing his aunt. He began to hunt down Flint, only going after cases that the Sandman was mentioned to be involved with. Through his investigation, he found out that the Sandman was in cohort with a new villain who wanted to destroy Quest Aerospace. He tracked them down to Oscorp and attacked them. Peter doesn't hold back. He seriously injured the henchmen and even killed some. When he finally got to the top of the building, the Green Goblin, using his glider to escape, saying that he had a prior arrangement, and while he told the Sandman to take care of Spider-Man, Peter faced off with the Sandman, and they fought thoroughly, destroying things. And Peter was badly hurt, and it didn't seem like he was doing any damage to Flint. He asked Flint why he did all the things he did, and he told Peter that it was just business. He had been hired by someone to close to him, to silence him and his family. Peter was angry and wanted to hurt Flint, but Flint was made out of sand and he couldn't be destroyed, but he could be trapped or immobilized. Peter broke one of the pipes on the plumbing and flooded the lab, reducing Flint to mud before he added cement to the mix, turning Flint into a block of concrete, trapped forever. He then proceeded to find and silence the Green Goblin. If there was anyone who could give him answers, it was the Green Goblin. He had attached a tracking device to his glider moments before he left, and he used that to find him. He was surprised that the trail led straight to the residence of the Osborns. Could it be that Norman Osborn was responsible for his misfortune? That was the only right answer. He had taken Norman as a father, and he was enraged to even think that Norman had been involved in everything that happened to his family, but it was the only right answer. The tracking device had led him to a secret room in the house, and inside it, he found the lair of the Green Goblin. With all his equipment, he wandered into the secret room. His senses went off, and in the last moment, he ducked as a rocket went flying over his head and exploding on the wall. He turned back to see Norman with a crazy smirk on his face and half dressed as the Goblin without the mask. He asked him why he ruined his life, and Norman only replied that the family was in the way and he needed them out. Peter then attacked Norman, and they engaged in a bloody fight that left both of them with bruises and tattered. At that moment, where Peter got the upper hand, he slammed Norman on the floor and bashed him while screaming at him as to why he ruined his life. In that moment, Harry walked in. As he was trying to make sense of why Peter was beating his father, Norman commanded his glider to surge forward with the aim of impaling Peter. But Harry ended up being impaled as he had been standing right behind Peter while Peter was able to get out of the way. And in anger, Peter threw Norman out of the window to his death, killing him too. He was heartbroken that the most important people in his life had been lost. He decided after the whole ordeal to hang his suit and quit being a hero. Peter dies. When Flint came out of the coma, he vowed that he was going to take revenge on Peter from that moment on. He began to track Peter down. He stalked him and found his house. He was angry, mostly because he had found out that while he was in a coma, he lost his wife and daughter to the illness that drove him to steal because he couldn't afford the payment. He had blamed Peter and vowed that as Peter had taken the most important people in his life, he was going to do the same to Peter. As he spent weeks watching Peter, he realized that Peter was madly in love with Mary Jane, and there was no better person to steal from him than her. So, one day, while Peter and Mary Jane had been together, he attacked them in the restaurant, injuring Peter and sending him unconscious before kidnapping Mary Jane. When Peter came through, he was told that the Sandman had kidnapped Mary Jane and was requesting that Spider-Man came to face him, and if not, he was going to kill Mary Jane. With no choice, Peter suited up and went to where the Sandman had requested that they meet. It was at an abandoned construction site. The Sandman was holding Mary Jane captive in sand and told Peter to reveal his identity to Mary Jane. He laughed and said he wanted her to know that she never knew him and he was nothing but a liar. Mary Jane was confused and asked him what the Sandman was talking about, and Peter said he was sorry and he didn't want her to find out like this. He removed his mask to reveal that he had been Peter all along. Mary Jane was consumed with mixed emotions, but later said that it all made sense and that it explained a lot about him. Without having the pleasure of the ending he was expecting, he got angry and began to squeeze Mary Jane. He then told Peter that the only way he was not going to hurt Mary Jane was if he didn't fight back. Peter was reluctant, but as the Sandman saw the reluctance in his eyes, he squeezed Mary Jane harder, which made her scream. Peter then told him to stop and told him that he was going to do it. With a malicious grin on his face, Flint Marco brutally mutilated Peter as blow after blow tore through Peter and weakened him. Mary Jane screamed harder and told him to fight back, which he refused as Flint laughed. After leaving Peter bloodied and beaten, the Sandman realized that hurting Peter wasn't going to make him feel better, but maybe killing Mary Jane will. Then he told Peter that he was going to make him watch as he killed Mary Jane. With newfound motivation, Peter attacked Flint with intense aggression, pushing him back until he ended in a puddle. Peter noticed that the water broke down his legs and made it difficult for him to reform. So Peter triggered the sprinkler system and flooded the building. As Flint disintegrated, he angrily threw Mary Jane towards an exposed steel pipe, hoping to kill her. Peter jumped in the way and was able to save Mary Jane, but got impaled himself. Flint made a sound that was so close to laughter as he got flushed away. Mary Jane ran towards Peter. She was in tears and tried to use her jacket to cover the injury that Peter had as he was bleeding out. He was also in tears, and blood spilled from his mouth. He told her that he had always loved her and still did love her. He only wished that he had been brave enough to express it to her. He held her hand until he lost his grip and died. Peter Parker's identity was revealed to the city after he died. They had proclaimed him a hero who was just a kid but still went out of his way to protect the city he loved. A lot of people had turned out for the memorial, and many who had been saved by him said how grateful they were for him and their lives that he saved. After everyone had left, including Aunt May and Uncle Ben, Mary Jane was alone at the memorial. She watched his headstone and vowed that she was going to continue where he had stopped and protect the city that he loved so much. With Harry's help and his access to Oscorp technology, Mary Jane took up the mantle of heroine, becoming a good version of the Green Goblin without the serum. She had gone through intense physical training to be able to handle the toils that came with being a heroine. She fought crime, just like Spider-Man, but after a while, she had found out that the Sandman was alive. She had tracked him down and wanted to take revenge on him, but she had remembered what had happened to Peter and decided to break this cycle of hate. She went to meet Flint and tried to see things from his side, and even though they had fought, it was obvious Flint didn't have it in him anymore. Killing Peter had not brought back his wife or daughter, and it didn't even make him feel any better. She was able to convince him to pay for his crimes before he agreed to get arrested voluntarily. She continued to fight evil in New York, protecting it from evildoers until she got married to Harry and retired from being a hero to focus on raising a family. Nobody dies. The Sandman attacked the house, but Peter managed to subdue him without having the chance to hurt anyone. He had convinced him to give up, telling him he really didn't want to hurt anybody. He was sorry for what had happened to his family, but it wasn't nobody's fault, and doing a bad thing was not going to make him feel better or bring back what he had lost. And Peter also told him he was sure that his family didn't want this either. It had turned out that they were not dead, as the police had brought his wife and his daughter to come see him and convince him not to do what he wanted to do. He was happy to see that they had survived, even without him, and then agreed to allow the police to take him away. He was going to pay for his crimes and be better for the sake of his family. And before he left, he told Peter that he wasn't working alone. He was working with Venom and the Green Goblin, and he also told Peter that he was sure they knew his identity. To protect them, Uncle Ben and Aunt May was drafted to be put into the Witness Protection Program for their own safety. The Sandman had also told him where he was supposed to meet them after he had killed his guardians and lured him. It was an obvious trap, but Peter decided to play along. Little did he know that they had eyes on the Sandman and knew he betrayed them. So, as a contingency, they kidnapped Mary Jane. He tracked them to the location where there was an abandoned church and found Mary Jane in the claws of Venom. He had her trapped in the black, perverse version of his webbings, and in no time, he had engaged Venom in a fight. As they fought through the building, they ended up in the bell tower. Venom threw Peter, crashing into the bell, but the loud chiming affected the Venom instead as the symbiote tried to escape from his skin. It turns out that the Green Goblin had been watching the fight too. He had decided to drop Mary Jane to her death after seeing how the fight between Venom and Spider-Man had gone. But Peter saved her by attaching the webbing to her and one to the Green Goblin's glider and also pulling him down too. They all crashed to the floor, but with less impart, Peter used his body to shield Mary Jane. She came out unhurt, while Peter and the Green Goblin were hurt. Venom was back again, and he threw Peter across the floor and fought him hard. But Peter knew his weakness. He shot some webbings up and pulled down the bell on top of Venom, and as it crashed into him, the Green Goblin threw a pumpkin bomb that ended up inside the bell. With the symbiote disconnected from Eddie Brock's, Peter used the opportunity to free him while the symbiote got destroyed by the pumpkin bomb inside the bell. As Eddie fell unconscious, the Green Goblin tried to flee, although already very injured and his glider damaged. He ended up crashing very hard into the wall and collapsing, with Peter wrapped the both of them in the thick webbings and left them for the police to find. With everything that happened and Peter's identity exposed, he was forced to go into witness protection with his friends and loved ones to keep them safe. He didn't have a choice but to hang up his suit for good and live a different life. Well, that's it for this video. It was fun writing the scenarios and outcomes for this video. And if you noticed, this fanfiction was a crisscross between the 3 parts of the first Spider-Man trilogy, which actually inspired this video. It highlighted how the story could have gone in 4 different scenarios, and if Uncle Ben had not died, and if Peter made different choices than the one he had originally made in the story arc of the first Spider-Man trilogy. Let me know in the comments section, what do you think of this video? What would be your scenario if you planned these 4 endings? I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you in the next video. Let me know also if I should do more DC fanfictions. And once again, this video is purely my own creativity and research, and I do it to entertain you guys. Until then, take care, and I'll see you in the next video.